Hi, welcome to this week's Authors Love Readers podcast, where we delve into the stories behind the stories. We're asking authors questions, some of them fun, some of them serious, and from their answers, you're going to learn things you never knew about the people who write the stories you love. My name is Patricia McLinn. I'm your host and designated question asker. Now, let's start the show. Hi everybody, this is Patricia McLinn, and I am here with Kay Coyte. Those of you who are on my readers list or on my Facebook page often hear about Kay or are asked to communicate with her as my assistant, and I thought it would be fun for you all to meet her in person. Say hello, Kay.
Hello, everyone.
And also to get to know a little bit about how we work and how we started working together. We actually started working together mumble years ago.
Many years ago.
Many years ago, yes.
More years ago.
At the Washington Post. And Kay was working there part-time in addition to working a full-time job at a horse magazine. So you want to tell them a little bit about the horse magazine or your background with horses?
Yes, I'm a graduate grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, graduate of University of Kentucky. And while I was an undergrad, I actually worked on the racetrack in the mornings, mucking out stalls and walking the horses until they cooled off. So I sort of parlayed that into my first job at a newspaper in upstate New York to cover horse racing at Saratoga, and went from there to a national trade horse racing magazine based outside of Washington, D.C. And I think I must be the only person who came to the Washington Post from a horse racing trade magazine. But I got my toe in the door to work part-time on the sports copy desk, and I really wasn't very good at first, but I got a bit more and more tied on as I stayed there, and I really wanted to make it work, so I did. And when Pat came on, I was probably a pretty regular, steady Eddie part-timer at that point. And I did eventually go full-time not long after Pat arrived.
And I arrived as a full-timer from the Charlotte Observer, Charlotte, North Carolina, where I had been an assistant sports editor. The Post had recruited me, and I thought, I will never have another chance to try the Washington Post without having written a query letter. So that was my big reason for doing a tryout with them, because I liked Charlotte. I liked it a lot, but it turned out, and the AME for sports, the assistant managing editor for sports, told me the winters were no worse in Washington, D.C. than they were in Charlotte. And the first winter, when it was really bad, I said, hey, and he said, I lied. Yeah, you will recognize that, right, Kay?
Right.
Our mutual former boss. So we worked together on the sports desk for quite a while, on the copy desk. Eventually, I was copy chief, de facto for sure. And by that time, though, I was also starting to write and publishing, I think. Kay was the only one at the Post who knew that I was writing until I'd actually sold a book.
And let me interject there. That year and a half or so was like the hardest thing I ever did in my whole life. Because Patricia was working on a book that was the book that became Hoops. So it was sports related, basketball coach meets student advisor. And I wasn't allowed to talk about it to anybody. And I like to talk about things. So, but I have to say that, we had the way the sports copy desk worked, we often had a full hour-long lunch, and that was to give us something to do in between editions of the newspaper, but keep us there late at night for late-breaking sports news. So I learned a lot about the publishing business right along as Pat was learning about the publishing business. It was kind of interesting.
Yeah, that was the old publishing business.
Yes.
And so then as I started publishing more regularly, I eventually went part-time, and I'd come to a crossroads where I either was going to apply for higher up jobs, including day editor. I was asked if I wanted to apply, and I said yes. And I thought about it overnight, and I thought, what do I really want to do with my life? And it was writing. So I came back the next day and said, no, I don't want to apply for that job, and I'm going part time. So, as far as I know, I am the only person at the Washington Post who ever got a going away party for going from full time to part time, and worked both day worked the 2 days in a row with the one day I was full time, one day I was part time. So then our paths sort of crisscrossed for a while because you went to Detroit,
Right.
right?
Yes.
And then you came back to the metro section,
Right.
right?
That's exactly right. In between that time, I had a child.
Yes.
So I went part-time in order to be with my son more often and followed my husband up to Detroit. I sort of vowed that I would never work. Before I left, I was with the news service, and that was the first time that as working colleagues, Patricia and I crossed paths again. She was at the news service before I was. Um, but I was also working on other desks, financial desk, style desk, metro. And I went back to work in sports in Detroit, which was a lot of fun because it was such a great sports town. But sadly, that newspaper went on strike shortly after we moved there, and I went running back to the Washington Post full time on the metro desk, and stayed there for a couple of years before an opportunity came to get back on with the news service.
Yeah, and by that time, because initially when I was part time, I worked for sports, financial, and the news service. I was doing a lot of juggling, and eventually I went to working strictly with the news service, which was so different from the 6 deadlines a night of sports and lots of pressure and how much can you get done in 22 seconds and handling lots of stories. So it was a different pace. It had different requirements, especially as we got more involved with graphics. But I continued there. And then I left the Post in '07 to move to northern Kentucky because I could write full time here because it was so much less expensive to live in than northern Virginia, where I lived. And Kay continued at the Post, was the head of the news service, and then retired. Actually, retired a year later than she was supposed to, according to what she'd told me, and when I was going to start her having be an assistant. And then a little over 2 years ago, so in the fall of 2015, she finally retires, and she sort of got thrown into the deep end of being an assistant for an indie published. Well, I think was I? No, I just finished being hybrid at that point, so I was strictly indie. Because my previous assistant had pulled back because of family issues. So instead of gaining help, I had Kay really, as I said, got thrown into the deep end. And I had told her going in, there are a lot of moving parts. So what's been your biggest surprise about this, Kay, the past 2 years?
I think the biggest surprise is just how things continually change. So I will think I have got something learned, and then it will evolve. So a good portion of what I do is a lot of physical uploading of Patricia's books to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Kobo, iBooks, etc., and making and price changes on those sites with their sales, that sorts of things. And seems like there will be snags or problems or just different things, and there's just changes all the time. And there's changes all the time in, of course, we do a lot of social media work on Facebook in particular, and Twitter and other platforms. And that is kind of constantly changing. What is most visible, and it's just always changing. And then of course, there's some things about the publishing business that to me are just counterintuitive. So I think at one point when I had, sort of some free reign to do some book sales, I think I set a book at $1.99, I think it was. And and I got this, kind of universal, like blowback. It was from Pat, but I think I was at a meeting where other people went, "Oh no, not $1.99," because apparently it has to do with where the dividing line for royalties jumps in. So there's just lots of minutia that I didn't know. But I will say this about how sometimes it's interesting how past jobs dovetail into present jobs. Back when
Mm,
Pat and I were both working on the news service, I used to joke that it was the Reader's Digest condensed Washington Post because that's what we did. It was at a time when there was more staff,
mm,
there was more newspapers, and part of our job was to boil down these Washington Post stories into concise stories that other newspapers who didn't have as much space they could use these. So
right.
it's really been helpful you know, in doing those stories, the Washington Post, I was mindful of each reporter's voice. I wanted to keep their voice, not just lop off the bottom 10 inches of the story, but try to keep the voice if it was humorous or, keep it balanced. It was strictly news. And this has been helpful. And sometimes I've had to boil um, book descriptions to smaller things, or I've had to boil something down into
Right.
what I think is how Pat would describe something. And I think this gives me at least a little bit of confidence to be able to do something like that.
I've always said that being an editor of any sort requires you to be a chameleon, being a good editor, because you do have to adapt to that voice of each, not only each writer, but each work, each story,
It's true.
because they can vary so much. So, and it helps a lot that, we've we've talked 5 days a week for mumble years, and we're not going to go into that exact how many years. So I think we do know how each would respond to things and might phrase things. And I think the changes are not going to stop by any means. In fact, I think they're going to accelerate. And the upshot or the upside of that is that they say that learning new things keeps you young. So we are never going
Yes,
to get old, Kay.
the changing in the publishing business, as I was leaving the Washington Post, um, the news service was in process of updating its very outdated website. And we were putting together one that was pretty good. Well, about the time this was a years long process. That's when Jeffrey Bezos bought the Washington Post, and there became many more good tech folks available to make this a better, sharper website. But at one point, one of our officials on the desk, not a news based person, but one of the more sales based people, said, "Well, we've got to get this website right because we won't keep changing it. We won't change it again for, 10 years." And we
Ah,
kind of
ha,
looked,
ha,
some of
ha.
us looked around the table and thought, 10 years, 10 years, we might be just thinking about things and they're going to appear somewhere, somehow. No one can
Right,
predict
right.
in
That's
the
crazy.
web, the internet publishing business, where anything is going to be 10 years from now.
Yeah, that's nuts. And as a side note, I was back at the Washington Post in April, this April of 2017. A writers' conference took me there, and I got together with some former colleagues. Yours must have been burning, Kay, because we were talking about you a lot. But the Post, since I left, had moved from the old spot where it was on 15th and L to a couple blocks away. And I will tell you, the new building is very snazzy. And my comment to these former colleagues is, hey, when I was here, we had mice. Now you've got marble. this, this doesn't seem right. This isn't fair. But but I gotta say, I miss people from the Post a lot. I miss the DC area a lot, but I don't miss working every day. So for that kind of work, I like the writing and the writing world. So as you listeners communicate with me through the newsletter. Oh, and one of the things Kay is doing now is the pets. You want to talk about that?
Sure, we just
in
We
my
all know
newsletter.
that Patricia is a huge dog fan and particularly a huge collie fan. You've seen pictures of
Yep.
Callie and previous collies and mixtures of collies. And actually, I had a dog in my mini dogs.
Named
My dog
Lassie.
named Lassie, which was ironic because my dog named Lassie was like a little brown mutt that looked nothing like a collie.
She had a
She had a
Lassie
She
heart.
did have a Lassie heart. But so did we those people? Patricia's readers love reading about the dog, and dogs also figure prominently in her books, many of her books. So we started maybe seeing pictures that people were posting on Facebook, and thought, well, let's just ask people to send their pictures in, and we'll make it a little regular feature of the newsletter. So we do that now once a month. We feature two or more pets, um, and I've got quite a few more, but I'm always on the lookout for more pet pictures.
It's been fantastic. They always make me smile every time we have them in, and they are just so cute. So I love that. Kay is doing another feature in the newsletter too, in honor of my mystery series Caught Dead in Wyoming. The sleuth, who's Elizabeth Margaret, also known as E.M. Danaher, is a consumer affairs reporter in this little tiny station in Wyoming, which is a major life change for her. So Kay is doing consumer protection type posts on my blog, and they in the newsletter, and then they show up in the blog too. So, do you have any favorites of those that
I
you've
don't know
done?
about favorites, but one thing that occurred here in Louisville recently was a speech by Frank Abagnale, who is the real life character from the Catch Me If You Can movie. He was played by Leonardo DiCaprio in the
Mm,
movie. And he came to speak in Louisville about identity protection. And I went down to hear him speak. I expected, kind of a dry um, presentation, but it was really a very heartfelt presentation, a lot about him personally. But because of this background that he has, and he pointed out during that speech that he was not particularly smart. He was just, a young man who was observant and knew how to take advantage of vulnerabilities in systems. And this is how he managed to pose as an airline pilot and fly all around the world, and as a doctor and
yeah.
other professions. But he's applied that across, banking and other things that we use every day. So he's had a complete 180 turn in his life, and now dedicates himself to
Mm,
informing people about scams and fraudulent practices. So I reported on that, the first one, and I'll keep reporting on that off and on in newsletters as we go along, because it was just really very interesting and some things I wasn't thinking about. Um, but I think some of the ones that kill me are scams that prey on old, lonely, elderly, lonely people, or some of the most vulnerable people. A whole nanny scam where people were pretending or scamming people, or scamming nannies, like pretending that there was jobs available for them. And um, just how low people
mm.
can go to make a buck is just very sad to me.
It is sad, but it's all the more important that people are on the alert and aware of them. And in the most recent Caught Dead in Wyoming book, Backstory, one of the scams that figures in it is people calling up and saying that you missed jury duty and you're going to get this huge, horrible fine unless you and be arrested unless you pay the fine, and you have to do it right now over using your credit card, or they have various ways that they do it. So I always think one of the lessons is you don't do anything on the phone right away. You always check, you check. You don't call the number they give you. You go find the main switchboard number for an organization or legal or business or whatever, and then you do the tracking
And that
down.
that was
So,
another that was one of the ones I wrote that was very
okay.
personal for me, because something like that, very similar to the jury duty scam, is the granny scam, where a person calls and pretends to be the
Mm,
grandson or nephew of an older person, and they use their confusion and their concern about this person to use Western Union to wire them money. And my mother nearly fell prey to this. And of course, this was, family lore that this was the case. And then my sister's husband, even though he knew about this, he almost did the same thing because it was so realistic. But thankfully, both of them, realized when it was a scam, hung up, and didn't pursue it.
yeah, that's so scary that it can happen to anybody, and it's taking advantage of your concerns, which is why they succeed and why they keep doing it. So, well, we may be having new features for you in the coming year. Not saying exactly what what it will be. This might actually be a surprise to Kay, but
Oh,
you never know when these things are going to show up. So it's been lots of fun talking with you. We talk pretty regularly, but letting the readers in on this conversation. And I hope you all have enjoyed it too. And we'll come back as we have more recordings of various kinds, about the books, about writing. Who knows where, well, maybe about dogs, huh? Who knows where these recordings will lead. But for now, we'll say, hope you have a great day. That's the show for this week. Hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for joining Authors Love Readers podcast. Remember, you can always find out more about our guest authors in the show notes, and you can find out more about me at www.patriciamclinn.com. You can also send in questions to be asked of future authors at podcast@authorslovereaders.com. Until next week, wishing you lots of happy reading. Bye.